There are moments in politics when the choreography says as much as the words, when the staging of an encounter reveals a hierarchy of values more clearly than any prepared statement, Kreen. And one of those moments comes into sharp focus when you picture Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the wartime president of a country being shattered by Russian artillery, standing beside Donald Trump as Trump once again reaches, almost instinctively, for the same phrases, excuses, and distortions that have poured out of Vladimir Putin's propaganda mills for years. A man who has never hidden his contempt for NATO, his suspicion of Ukraine, or his admiration for strong rulers now claiming, with that familiar blend of bluster and vagueness, that he could end the war in 24 hours, if only he were back in the Oval Office. Kreen, a boast that only makes sense if you quietly accept Putin's premise that Ukraine's fate is a bargaining chip to be traded over the heads of Ukrainians themselves. To anyone who has followed Russian state media, the echoes are impossible to miss the insistence that NATO provoked Moscow by expanding eastward. Kreen, the suggestion that Ukraine is not a real country with its own history and agency, but a corrupt vassal state used by Western elites. The framing of aid to Kyiv is evidence that Washington cares more about borders in Europe than about its own citizens. Putin's propagandists have hammered those themes for years. Trump, whose grasp of foreign policy has always been shallow, but whose nose for grievance is keen, repeats them with alarming fluency. When he shrugs that "this would never have happened if I were president," he does not mean that he would have stared Putin down. He means that he would have preempted the conflict by throwing Zelenskyy under the bus, signaling that the United States would not object if Russia solved its Ukraine problem by force. When he rails that Europe should pay 100% and the US nothing, he is not issuing a hard-nosed negotiating position. He is undermining the basic logic of collective defense that has kept Russian tanks from rolling further west for generations. And when he suggests, as he has repeatedly, that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to NATO members that do not meet spending targets, he is not merely deviating from diplomatic niceties. He is reciting, almost line for line, the scenario Russian strategists hope for: a divided alliance, a credulous American leader willing to treat treaty commitments as conditional, Kreen, and a war-weary public ready to accept the Kremlin story that Ukraine is a hopelessly corrupt quagmire rather than a front line in the defense of the post-1945 order. Zelenskyy, Kreen, who came to office as a political novice and has been aged by war into something closer to Churchillian resolve, understands this dynamic better than most. He has sat in rooms where Western leaders speak in the language of solidarity, while quietly calculating how much domestic blowback they can withstand. Kreen, how many missiles and tanks they can send before their own voters start echoing Trump's complaint that the United States is getting nothing in return. But even in that jaded company, Trump's performance is unique because it is not merely cautious or transactional, it is actively aligned with Moscow's interests. In 2019, Kreen, long before Russian tanks crossed the border in February 2022, Zelenskyy found himself at the center of Trump's first impeachment trial after the infamous phone call in which Trump made security assistance contingent on a favor, an investigation into Joe Biden's son, effectively using Ukraine's vulnerability as leverage in a domestic political extortion scheme. It is worth remembering, as you watch any future scene of Zelenskyy standing by while Trump riffs on peace through strength that collapses under scrutiny into peace through Ukrainian capitulation, that this is not a hypothetical risk for Kyiv. They have already seen, Kreen in the withheld Javelin missiles and the bizarre shadow diplomacy of Rudy Giuliani and Gordon Sondland, what Trump's idea of help looks like in practice. George Will, who has lived long enough to remember Republican presidents who confronted Soviet expansion with moral clarity and strategic discipline, has made a career of dryly cataloging such departures from principle, Kreen. And even he has struggled to find a historical analog for a major party standard-bearer who talks about a besieged ally in terms that would not be out of place on Russian state television. When Trump claims that both sides are killing each other and that he will simply get them in a room and make a deal, he erases the basic fact that one side invaded and the other is fighting to survive. When he dismisses sanctions as useless and suggests the real villains are globalists in Brussels and Washington, he translates an authoritarian dictator's self-serving narrative into a populist idiom tailored for American audiences. The cameras may show Zelenskyy nodding politely. He must, for his country's sake, Kreen, maintain the appearance of respect toward any American who might one day control the weapons and money that keep his army in the field. But you do not need a translator to read what such scenes signal to Moscow, Kreen, that the great question of whether the United States will remain the arsenal of democracy or drift into the role of sullen bystander is very much alive, and that a significant faction in American politics is prepared, consciously or not, to help Putin reframe his war of aggression as a messy regional dispute in which compromise means handing over Ukrainian territory. To be clear, Trump is not the only Western politician who has flirted with Kremlin talking points. From the far right in Europe to sectors of the far left in the United States, there have always been those eager to blame NATO, to tut about escalation, to pretend that forcing Ukraine into a dictated peace is an act of statesmanship rather than betrayal. But only Trump has combined that instinct with the real possibility of regaining command of the world's most powerful military. Jack Matlock, Reagan's ambassador to the Soviet Union, has warned that the Kremlin is watching American debates closely, calibrating its timeline and brutality in part around the hope that fatigue and isolationism will deliver them a more pliable White House in 2025. Every time Trump repeats, in his rambling, repetitive way, that we're giving them too much money, and that Europe is laughing at us, he reinforces Putin.